It would, however, prevent the President from carrying out any further hostilities without Congress's approval. And it would exercise Congress's constitutional power to provide some much-needed accountability. I believe this is a responsible approach, and I believe this House should support it. I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from California, the ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Berman.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Speaker of the House has made some very legitimate points, but then his conclusion is so contrary to the points he made. The proposition before us today, Mr. McClintock is right. It is an authorization of a series of acts of belligerence, acts of war, that by their own definition cannot possibly help us either achieve the humanitarian goal of this mission or achieve the goal of the true humanitarian goal of removing Gaddafi from power. We are authorizing intelligence sharing, aerial refueling, operational planning, intelligence gathering, but we are denying the only aspects of this operation that can allow us to achieve that goal: the suppression of air defense systems and the utilization of drones with missiles to stop Gaddafi from resuming his effort to massacre his own people. I understand the argument, you don't buy my notions of our national security interests, you don't see the context of bringing this operation to a halt in terms of what it does to the stability of the democracy movements in Egypt and Tunisia, you don't see any consequences in terms of Syria, the larger Middle East, or the damage to the alliance. I understand and accept that argument, but Mr. Rudy doesn't he tries to have it both ways, but in fact comes up with a proposal that ensures that the mission is allowed to continue, but by definition cannot achieve its goals. It is the worst. It is not the reasonable proposal. It is the worst of all solutions. If you're going to authorize an operation that hopes through air power and other methods, you don't exclude the only parts that can possibly achieve success. If you're against this operation, you stop the funding of the operation. Mr. Rooney and apparently a number of members of the majority want to have it both ways. We don't like Gaddafi, so we want to do something, but we don't want to do anything that could work, but we don't want to come out against the operation. But the fact is, you're ending the operation if this were to become law, because our European friends have said very clearly that those parts of this operation that this amendment prohibits, those parts of the operation we cannot undertake if you are not doing it. So why not be straightforward? Why not do what a number of colleagues on the other side have called for? Stop funding the operation. Don't try to have it both ways. Ensure the operation's defeat and end the operation while pretending to still be interested in seeing Gaddafi go and the operation succeed. I urge a no vote from anyone who cares about consequences of what they vote on.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to my friend and colleague, the Chairman of the Committee on Armed Services, the gentleman from California, Mr. McKeon.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 2278. My colleague has set forth a responsible plan that would effectively limit the United States' role in Libya. This bill would allow U.S. forces to continue to conduct search and rescue missions, aerial refueling, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and provide operational planning assistance. Mr. Speaker, this is what NATO has told us would allow them to continue to carry out the mission. These are very critical functions. That is all that they have asked us to do as we move forward, and it helps the President be truthful in saying that we're not engaged in hostile actions. This bill would clearly end funding for all other military missions in Libya. Of particular concern to many members is the United States' continued engagement in strike and suppression of enemy air defense missions. The President has repeatedly stated that the U.S. is not engaged in hostilities and the congressional authorization is not necessary to continue our role in this operation. I share with many of my colleagues the view that firing a missile at a target in a foreign nation does indeed constitute hostile action. This disagreement is at the root of the issue at hand. H.R. 2278 would put an end to that debate by explicitly defining the congressionally authorized scope of the U.S. military mission in Libya. The administration has yet to present Congress and the American people with a clear strategic objective for our involvement in Libya. Furthermore, to date, we have not been informed of a specific end goal under which the U.S. military operations would cease. This threatens the effectiveness of our mission and could soon create an unjustifiable strain on our military, while they remain engaged in two other theaters of operation critical to our national security interest. Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to join me in support of this bill. And how much time do I have left?
1 minute remains.
No, how much time do I have left?
You have another minute.
The gentleman has 1 minute remaining.
Of his three? I'd be happy to yield to the
Thank
gentleman.
you. Wouldn't you feel better if we could add, as a fifth item in this list of things, suppression of enemy air defenses? The reason I say that is I think we're going to have a difficult time doing any of these other missions unless we have suppression. And I was just over there at Albiano and Sigonella, and we were told by the Navy that the Allies do not have enough suppression to be able to continue to do these bombing missions without U.S. help. And I think if we could clarify that that is not somehow banned.
You've just about used up my whole minute.
My
good friend from Washington, there are a lot of things that would make me feel better. If we could go back and start this whole thing over, there are a lot of things that would make me feel better. But the President has said we're not engaged in hostilities, and I think we would agree that when we're firing missiles, when we are having
30 seconds.
missions with our fighter planes suppressing ground fire, I believe that would be, most of us would agree that that is hostile. And the NATO people, we met with the military from Great Britain. They told us what we have in here would allow them to continue successfully their missions. So
The time of the gentleman from California has expired. The gentleman from...
Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to join me in support of this bill and reserve the balance of my time.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from
Thank you. If I
Washington.
may inquire of the sponsor, Mr. Rooney, I'm the last speaker, or we only have one left. Do you have more speakers or just one? Okay. Then I will yield myself the balance of my time. The gentleman is recognized for 4 minutes. Thank you. There are a number of arguments about this issue and arguments in favor of ending the mission in Libya, and I think the Speaker articulated one, which is basically we support the idea of the removal of Gaddafi, and they support the idea of supporting the people in Libya who are asking for a representative government. They just don't like our President's process. But that argument really doesn't make sense, because if, in fact, their big complaint is that Congress hasn't had the opportunity to authorize this, then the Speaker of the House has had, by his own admission, 100 days to offer that voice, to come up and say, no, we support the mission, but here's how we want to limit it. And they have not done that. And I agree very strongly with Mr. Berman's statements. You can't have it both ways. You can't say we would like to remove Gaddafi, we would like to support the Libyan people, but we're going to offer up resolutions that are going to stop that from happening. Now, we can argue back and forth about that process, but clearly the Speaker of the House had an option in front of him to deal with that process issue. And this isn't it. As has been pointed out, this will stop what we are doing in Libya. And if you support that, let me just say, you know, I support Mr. Kucinich in the sense that he is very honest. He don't like what's going on there. He wants it stopped. That's a legitimate position. But to stand up and say, yes, we have to support the Libyan people, yes, Gaddafi should go, we're just going to cut the legs out from under the effort that would actually do that because of a complicated process argument, is not a legitimate point. I also want to point out, people are legitimately concerned about the U.S. being too militant in our approach, and I agree with that. We cannot be the policeman for the world. We should not always carry the load. But in this case, it is a very, very limited mission that we have. For once, NATO is actually carrying the bulk of the mission. So while I agree with Mr. Frank's comments from earlier that NATO needs to step up and do more, we finally have an instance when they are stepping up and doing more, and we want to pull the rug out from under them for the tiny little piece of help that we are giving that makes this mission possible. This is a limited role, and we must recognize that. The Speaker also emphasized that we would like to have all the answers going in. We'd like to know what the mission to get rid of Gaddafi is exactly. Well, you don't always have all the answers, and this has evolved. Initially, our mission was clear. Stop Gaddafi from crushing the forces who were trying to rise up and have a voice in their own government, and we did that. And incidentally, we do have some answers about who these rebels are. You want to know who they are? Look at Benghazi. What's going on in Benghazi, the place that is controlled by the people in opposition to Muammar Gaddafi? It is not the Muslim Brotherhood. It is not al-Qaeda. It is the people of Libya wanting a representative government who are running that place. So let's stop acting conveniently like we don't know who these people are. We do have a very good idea of who they are, and they are deserving of our support. We have a clear, limited mission. If we vote for Rooney, we pull the rug out from under that mission. We put Gaddafi in a position to stay in power, and we undermine a group of people who are asking for a legitimate voice in their government. And keep in mind, again, this is a very limited use of U.S. power in a very positive way. Whatever the process arguments are that brought us to this point, don't let them have the United States look like we don't support people standing up for the very values that we continually espouse throughout the world. I urge defeat of this resolution and support for what we are doing in Libya, and with that I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Washington yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, can I inquire to the time remaining on our side?
The gentleman from Florida has 4 minutes remaining.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 1 minute to my friend and colleague from Nebraska, Mr. Terry.
The gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Terry, is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I have, during my tenure here, voted twice to empower our military to take action. The first time was with Afghanistan, and the President came to the Congress and made a powerful case that it was in our national security interest to do so, and I supported that. Then with Iraq, and the President came to Congress, spent a significant amount of time providing evidence, making a case that there was a national security interest. This time, however, it was a surprise to me and most of my colleagues that this mission was occurring. There's been no attempt to define what the national security interests are, the United States' interest in this military action. And so without that, I can't look my constituents in the eyes and tell them why we are in Libya right now and active in military strikes against that nation state. So, the one constitutional power that Congress has explicitly is the purse strings. We are exercising that right. I support that effort to hold or pull those strings tight, and let's stop the flow of money into this action.
Gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Kucinich.
Gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Kucinich, is recognized for 1 minute.
I want to thank Mr. Rooney and thank my colleagues. I think this has been a very important debate for this country and for our Constitution. I'm opposed to this war and I want to end it. And I think Mr. Rooney's bill is a powerful step in the direction of ending the war. But it's not the only step that we should take. It's the first step. The first step is you vote for Mr. Rooney's, you limit the war, you stop the combat ops, and then the second step would be to vote on a defense appropriations amendment that would strike all funding for the war. So we take 2 steps here. The first step today, and we have some of the best people in this Congress have been in this debate today, and they don't agree with Mr. Rooney's bill, but what they've said is that this bill would end the mission in Libya. And they've said that if you don't have the ability to suppress, you couldn't continue with the bombing campaign. So these are people on our side of the aisle who want to defeat this bill. They've made the argument, I think, as to why we should pass it. And so I want to thank Mr. Rooney for his leadership, and I urge a vote in favor of Mr. Rooney's bill.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself the balance of my time.
The gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, we've heard a lot of arguments today, and we've had a great debate, a debate that we really should have been having over the last 100 days or so, one that could have been spurred on by the administration for coming here and making the arguments why we should authorize or should not authorize hostilities.
Not in order. Mr. Speaker.
Is correct. The House is not in order. Those members at the back of the chamber, please discontinue your conversation so we can complete this debate. Gentleman from Florida.
The President had the opportunity to come and make the case to this body and chose not to. The War Powers Act is clear. He's violated that law. Some have said it's unconstitutional, but the courts have never weighed in on it. So it is the law of the land, and it's one that we have to abide by. But we can send resolution after resolution to the Senate saying that we don't agree, we don't authorize. In the end, the power that we have is the power of the purse, as Mr. Terry just said. And we have to exercise that power in this House and say that we aren't going to spend money for hostilities in Libya. We heard, you know, the mission, if you want to take out Gaddafi or if you want to free the Libyan people and give them the liberty to reserve, number one, it was never the mission to begin with to take out Gaddafi. That has somehow morphed over time. We don't even know who the people are that we're supposedly setting free. So without that debate and without that argument that the President has failed to make, and I appreciate the debate we've had today because I think it's been very helpful, quite frankly, all we can do is say until the President comes and makes that case and gets authorization, he won't get funds. And at the same time responsibly saying to our NATO allies, we'll support you in the rear, but we are not engaging in hostile acts. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time. Yield back the balance of my time, sorry.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 328, the previous question is ordered on the bill. The question is on engrossment and third reading of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. Third reading.
A bill to limit the use of funds appropriated to the Department of Defense for United States Armed Forces in support of North Atlantic Treaty Organization Operation Unified Protector with respect to Libya unless otherwise specifically authorized by law.
Question is on passage of the bill. All those in favor respond by saying aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker,
Washington rise.
On that I request a recorded vote.
Has been requested. Those in favor of a recorded vote will rise. A sufficient number having arisen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 15-minute vote.
The House has spent the day debating two measures on U.S. military operations in Libya. This bill would cut Libya funding from the current Defense Department budget. It would prevent the President from continuing a U.S. combat role in Libya, such as drone attacks, but would allow the continued intelligence, aerial refueling, search and rescue operations, and planning for the NATO operation. This is a 15-minute vote, and this follows the failure to pass an earlier authorization resolution that would have authorized the President to fight a limited war in Libya, but would not allow ground troops. That fell by a vote of 123 to 295, most Republicans voting against that, and Democrats were split on that vote. The vote there was 115 to 70. The Associated Press defining the debate today in the House as a constitutional showdown between the Commander-in-Chief and Congress, and much of it had to do with the War Powers Act, the 1973 War Powers Act, We have linked to a good review and analysis in PolitiFact on our website. If you go to cspan.org, you will see the link there. And this is not the last that Congress will hear about Libya. The Hill reports this afternoon that John Kerry next week will lead a discussion in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on the prudence and legality of continued U.S. participation in the NATO operation. He and Senator McCain have introduced a resolution in the Senate similar to the one that fell earlier in the House, authorizing limited engagement in Libya. And you may have heard a few minutes ago Dennis Kucinich talking about an effort that he will bring back when the Defense Department bill comes back on the floor. In July, he and Justin Amash of Michigan proposing an amendment to the Defense Department bill for 2012 that would cut off all funding for Libya operations. The House is out next week for the district work period, and they're back after the July 4th holiday. So this should be the last bit of legislative work and the last roll call vote on the bill on Libya, H.R. 2278, cutting off most funding for operations in Libya. The House today has debated two measures on U.S. military operations in Libya. The earlier measure, which would have authorized the president to conduct limited operations, a limited war, that fell by a vote of 123 to 295. This bill would cut off funding from current defense spending for NATO operations, except in the cases of air reconnaissance, search and rescue, and things like that, operational planning for the NATO operation. Again, the last vote was 123 to 295, so that fell. And this is a 15-minute vote. Still, obviously, a number of votes yet to come. It will be the last roll call vote of the day and of the next week or so, as the House is going out for the district work period, and they won't be back until after July the 4th.
On this vote, the yeas are 180, the nays are 238, and the bill is not passed. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Ready to place whenever you're ready.
This gentleman from New Jersey rise.
Mr. Speaker, I present a privileged report for printing under the rule.
The clerk will report the title.
Report to accompany H.R. 2354, a bill making appropriations for energy and water development and related agencies for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2012, and for other purposes.
Referred to the Union calendar and ordered printed. Pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 21 are reserved. House will be in order.
Okay. The chair lays before the House a communication.
The Honorable the Speaker, House of Representatives. Sir, pursuant to Section 194 of Title 14, United States Code, as Chairman of the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, I am required to designate 3 members of the United States Coast Guard Academy Board of Visitors. I designate Representative Frank Ginta of New Hampshire, Representative Andy Harris of Maryland, and Representative Rick Larson of Washington to serve on the Board of Visitors. Since its founding in 1876, the Coast Guard Academy, based in New London, Connecticut, has accomplished its mission of educating, training, and developing leaders of character who are ethically, intellectually, professionally, and physically prepared to serve their country. The Board of Visitors meets annually with staff, faculty, and cadets to review the Academy's programs, curricula, and facilities to assess future needs. The Board of Visitors plays an important supervisory role in ensuring the continued success of the Academy and the tradition of excellence of the U.S. Coast Guard. Thank you for your consideration in this matter. Signed sincerely, John L. Micah, Chairman.
Pursuant to 20 United States Code 4303 and the order of the House of January 5, 2011, the Chair announces the Speaker's appointment of the following members of the House to the Board of Trustees of Gallaudet University.
Mr. Yoder of Kansas, Ms. Woolsey of California.
Pursuant to 44 United States Code 2702 and the order of the House of January 5, 2011, the Chair announces the Speaker's reappointment of the following member on the part of the House to the Advisory Committee on Records of Congress.
Mr. Jeffrey W. Thomas of Columbus, Ohio.
The Chair lays before the House a communication.
The Honorable the Speaker, House of Representatives. Sir, under Clause 2G of Rule 2 of the Rules of the U.S. House of Representatives, I herewith designate Robert Reeves, Deputy Clerk, and Kirk Boyle, Legal Counsel, to sign any and all papers and do all other acts for me under the name of the Clerk of the House, which they would be authorized to do by virtue of this designation, except such as are provided by statute, in case of my temporary absence or disability. This designation shall remain in effect for the 112th Congress or until modified by me. With best wishes, I am, signed sincerely, Karen L. Haas, Clerk of the House.
At this point, the Chair will now entertain requests for 1-minute speeches. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Ohio rise?
I request permission to address the House for 1 minute.
The Chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Will the House be in order? The gentlewoman from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to applaud the efforts by the National Labor Relations Board to modernize their rules to promote efficiency and fairness in the labor organization process. The charge of the NLRB is to ensure that our workers get a fair shake. But for far too long, working men and women have had to deal with an outdated and lopsided system that puts the wants of big corporations over the needs of employees. At a time when our middle class is consistently under attack, these new proposed rules represent a positive step in restoring a more level playing field for workers. Our workers deserve a fair system. Those who work to make our world turn deserve the opportunity to make a living for themselves and their families. I look forward to the NLRB adopting and implementing these new provisions to bring their rules into the 21st century and give our working families a fighting chance to strive and achieve the American dream. I yield back.
Any further 1-minute requests? And for what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana rise?
Address the House for 1 minute.
The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the President made a decision to raid 30 million barrels out of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Now, of course, one thing the President did yesterday in that decision was he acknowledged that supply has an impact on price, which is a reversal of his previous statements. The problem is, rather than actually opening up known reserves of American oil where we can go and create tens of thousands of American jobs and get rid of some of this dependency on some of these Middle Eastern countries, what the President said instead was he's just going to go and raid America's, in essence, our safety net. This Strategic Petroleum Reserve is there for national emergencies. It's not there just because maybe the President feels it would be politically popular for a couple of days to do something. This doesn't even get us past 2 days' worth of America's supply. We have known reserves that this President is shutting off all across this country, and we can actually reduce our dependence on Middle Eastern oil if we go out and create those jobs, create that American energy, rather than raiding our savings account for oil. And so the President's decision was a failed policy that doubles down on his previous failed policy on energy that has gotten us to skyrocketing gas prices. And, of course, we're going to be back here again in just a couple of days when this short-term fix runs out. Instead, we should put a real energy policy in place that reduces our dependence on foreign oil. Yield back.
Oregon rise. Without objection, the Chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday we had the inaugural briefing of the Congressional Neurological Science Caucus. The caucus seeks to involve and inform people on Capitol Hill about the advances, opportunities, and challenges that face us with neuroscience. I appreciate the leadership of my colleague, Kathy McMorris Rogers, who is founding co-chair of this effort and someone who cares deeply about neuroscience issues, achieved in part through some difficult personal experience. I admire her courage and appreciate her adding to this important agenda. We're discovering so many areas related to the brain and so much about how the neurological system works, how it's damaged, how it recovers, how the brain responds to our environment, understanding interrelationships between traumatic brain injury, hydrocephalitis, dementia, Alzheimer's. We stand to gain so much from this research. Developments in neuroscience offer the greatest opportunity for the 26% of American adults who suffer from mental disorders to reduce and perhaps avoid dysfunction, disease, to live better, healthier lives. The tremendous toll on victims and their families, their employees, employers, and friends, the federal government needs to be aggressively involved and engaged. We hope the Neuroscience Caucus can help do just that.
Are there any further one-minute requests? The Chair lays before the House the following personal request.
Leave of absence requested for Mr. Backus of Alabama for today.
Without objection, the request is granted. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5, 2011, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It was said, from this day to the ending of the world, we and it shall be remembered. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers, for today he that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother. Shakespeare penned this hundreds of years ago in Henry V. It represents the unfailing commitment a warrior has for his fellow warriors. Since 2004, 36 men and women from the 2nd Congressional District area of Texas that I represent have served honorably for this country, the United States, and they gave their lives for the cause of freedom in Iraq and Afghanistan. Their photographs are over here to my left. You notice, Mr. Speaker, they are of all races. They are men and they are women. They are from all branches of the service. They are enlisted personnel and they are officers in the United States military. I'd like to honor each of them today by name and rank and branch of service and a comment or two about each one of them. These are the sons of liberty, the daughters of democracy of America. They are our heroes. As we approach July the 4th of July, as we like to call it, where America celebrates its independence, and we celebrate not only our independence but our freedom and our liberty. We wave the flag, we attend parades, and all of those are good things about America. See, it's okay to be a patriot, and it's okay to show our patriotism as a nation. But as we approach July the 4th, that important day in our history, I believe it's equally important that we remember that our freedom and our liberty has always cost America, and it's cost America its finest, its youth. These men and women, like patriots before them, gave up their youth so that we can have a future. Patrick Henry, the great orator during the Revolutionary times, said that the battle, sir, is not to the strong alone, it is to the vigilant, to the active, to the brave. We are fortunate those words still ring true today, Mr. Speaker, and American warriors overseas carry those values into battle. And these are 36 of them, the roll call of the noble 36. Each of them have connections to Southeast Texas, and I'd like to mention each one of them because they deserve our recognition, but we also need to always remember them and their families. Because you see, when these young men and women went off to war, their families went to war too, but their families stayed stateside, and they were ever vigilant while their sons and daughters and husbands and wives went overseas. The first individual here, Mr. Speaker, is Staff Sergeant Russell Slade, United States Marine Corps from my hometown of Humble, Texas. He was killed at the age of 34. He was killed on November the 9th, 2004, and when Russell told his mother, Peggy Slade, that he was joining the United States Marine Corps after finishing high school, he told her that she knew he would not like it, but he was going to do it anyway. And he did. And he joined the Marine Corps, and he was killed in action. Peggy Slade, his mother, who I've known since Russell's death, has become very active in the Blue and Gold Star Moms in Southeast Texas. To refresh your memory, Mr. Speaker, a Blue Star Mom is an individual who has a son or daughter overseas, and they carry a flag, or they have a flag on their window at their home that has a blue star in that flag. Gold Star Moms are those who have lost a son or a daughter overseas in war, and they have a gold star. Peggy Slade is a leader in the Gold Star Moms in Southeast Texas. Next to him is Lance Corporal Wesley Cannon, United States Marine Corps, Friendswood, Texas. He was killed on November the 10th, the day after Russell was killed. He is from Friendswood, Texas, and he told his dad he always wanted to be a Marine. And he had that ambition to serve as a Marine for 20 years. He was a proud Texan, and when he was home on leave, he bought a new pickup truck so he could show his Marine buddies his new bumper sticker that said, "Don't mess with Texas." He was that kind of individual that loved Texas and loved his country. The third individual, Lance Corporal Fred Lee Masel. Fred Masel was killed on January the 26th, 2005. He also a member of the United States Marine Corps. He was from Spring, Texas, and he was killed in a helicopter crash in the Al-Anbar province on his way to begin security preparations for the historic Iraqi elections that took place a few days later in January of 2005. Later, those 4 days later, I was in Iraq to witness those successful elections. Lance Corporal Masel made those first free elections for the Iraqi people possible. And those elections were important for the history of that country, but Lance Corporal Masel was one of those individuals who gave his life so that another country, another people, could have those elections. The fourth individual that is on this poster board is Private First Class Wesley Riggs of the United States Army. He was killed when he was 19 years of age on May the 17th, 2005. He was from Baytown, Texas, or Beach City, Texas. Both towns claim him. He graduated in just 3 years from high school, and he loved agriculture. The fifth individual is Sergeant William Musin. Sergeant William Bill Musin is from Kingwood, Texas, near my area of where I live, and he was a member of the United States Army. He went off to Texas A&M University, but he dropped out of school and enlisted in the United States Army because of 9/11. Amazing individual, these people who left their careers after 9/11 and joined the United States military to protect the rest of us. Over here on the far left is Lance Corporal Robert Robbie Martinez, United States Marine Corps. He was killed at the age of 20 on December the 1st, 2005, from a small rural community called Cleveland, Texas. He dreamed of getting a degree in education and becoming a baseball coach after his career in the Marines. Today, there is a post office in Cleveland, Texas, named in his honor. When we dedicated the post office for Robbie Martinez in Cleveland, Texas, the whole town turned out for it. In fact, the United States Air Force had a flyover during that ceremony and that dedication. the people of Cleveland love Robbie Martinez and his family and appreciate his sacrifice for America. The seventh individual is Staff Sergeant Jerry Michael Durbin, United States Army, from Spring, Texas. He was killed on January the 25th, 2006 at the age of 27. He's from Houston, Texas, and he was a gifted artist, and the day he was killed, he called his wife to tell her he loved her, and shortly thereafter, he was killed in action. The eighth individual is Tech Sergeant Walter Moss. Tech Sergeant Walter Moss was a member of the United States Air Force. He was 37 years of age, and he was killed on March the 30th, 2006. He also is from Houston, Texas. He joined the Air Force after high school, and he served in Operation Desert Storm. He specialized in detecting and defusing makeshift bombs, and he was killed while defusing an IED. I repeat, he was killed while defusing an IED. An IED, Mr. Speaker, that is the way that the cowards we fight us. They don't come out in the open. Heavens no, they won't do that. They would lose. So they lie in wait in their holes, in their caves, and they put bombs, landmines, IEDs as we call them, where they know our troops will come by, and then they remotely set those off. Tech Sergeant Walter Moss was an individual that was trained to defuse those IEDs, but one exploded while he was trying to protect other warriors. The ninth individual is Private First Class Kristen Menchaca. Kristen Menchaca was a member of the United States Army. He's from Houston, Texas. He was killed at the age of 23 on June the 16th, 2006. He is also from Houston, Texas. And when he joined the United States Army, he wanted to be in the infantry. Kristen's wife said that being in the military was what he always wanted to do. He was kidnapped and tortured and murdered by enemy forces. His murder made national news because of the brutality of the people we fight against after they captured Kristen Menchaca. Number 10 on this poster is Staff Sergeant Ben Williams of the United States Army, rather the United States Marine Corps. He was age of 30 years of age when he was killed on June the 20th, 2006. He's from Orange, Texas, down in the refinery area of southeast Texas. He joined the United States Marines right after high school, and he served his country for 12 years. He was serving his third duty in Iraq when he was killed on June 20th, 2006. Lance Corporal Ryan Miller. Right here is his photograph, Mr. Speaker. Ryan Miller, at the age of 19, member of the United States Marine Corps, was killed on September the 14th, 2006. He is from Pearland, Texas. He was a third-generation Marine. He graduated early so he could enlist and follow in his father and grandfather's footsteps. After his tour of duty was over, he wanted to become a Houston police officer, just like his parents, who are Houston police officers. Staff Sergeant Edward Reynolds, Jr. Over here, Mr. Speaker. United States Army, he was killed at the age of 27 on September the 26th, 2006, just a few days after Lance Corporal Ryan Miller was killed. He's from Port Arthur, Texas, another refinery area in southeast Texas. He was looking forward to New Year's Eve because that's when he was going to get married. And he was a man that pushed, as his fellow warriors say, pushed others to succeed in what they do. Next is Captain David Frazier, 13th individual on this poster. He was a member of the United States Army. He was killed on November the 26th, 2006, and at the age of 25. He was from Spring, Texas. And you might notice You can barely see it, but you might notice his uniform, Mr. Speaker. He was a West Point graduate. He wasn't just a regular cadet at West Point. He graduated top student in civil engineering. Captain David Frazier gave his life at the age of 25 for America. Lieutenant or Lance Corporal Luke Yepsen, member of the United States Marine Corps. He was killed on September the 14th, 2006, and he was from Kingwood, Texas. He was at the age of 20 when he was killed. He also attended Texas A&M University after high school, and he dropped out to enlist in the United States Marine Corps. Just like Staff Sergeant Bill Mewson left Texas A&M during school to fight for America. Specialist Dustin Donica, United States Army. At the age of 22, he was killed on December the 28th, 2006. He was from Spring, Texas. And when he was asked why he joined the United States Army, here's what he said, Mr. Speaker. Most people in my generation want something for them. I just wanted to give something back. That's why I joined the United States Army. 16th individual of our roll call of the Noble 36 is Specialist Ryan Berg. Here's his photograph, Mr. Speaker. He was a member of the United States Army. He was killed at the age of 19. He's from Sabine Pass, Texas. You've probably never heard of that place. Sabine Pass is a very small community. It is on the furthest southeastern point of Texas, right next to Louisiana. He joined the Army on his 18th birthday, and he was the first soldier from Sabine Pass to be killed in Operation Iraqi Freedom. Staff Sergeant Terrence Dunn, United States Army. Here's his photograph. At the age of 38, he was killed on February the 2nd, 2007. He was from Atascocita, Texas. He enlisted in the Army several years after high school, and to his fellow soldiers, he was known as Dunneman because he could get anything done. And next is Lance Corporal Anthony Aguirre. He was a member of the United States Marine Corps, and at the age of 20, he was killed on February the 22nd, 2007. He was from Channelview, Texas. He entered the United States Marine Corps because he believed, like a lot of other people believe, it was the toughest branch of the military. You got to love those Marines, Mr. Speaker. Over here we have Private First Class Brandon Bobb, United States Army. He likewise was from Port Arthur, Texas, and he was killed at the age of 20 on July the 17th, 2007. He was always cheerful and was a soldier that others looked to for support and to lend a helping hand. And he was always thinking about somebody else other than himself, according to his buddies in the military. Number 20, Private First Class Zachary Inslee, United States Army, age 21, killed on July the 23rd, 2007, from Spring, Texas. You might notice, Mr. Speaker, there's a pattern here. 18, 19, 20, and 21-year-olds. America's youth go to war to represent the rest of us. But Zach was an appreciator of the arts. He enjoyed drawing and playing his guitar. It was his drawing ability that stood out. In high school, he entered and won a poster contest with his design. But after he joined the Army, he was killed at the age of 21. Number 21, Army Specialist Kamisha Block. She was a member of the United States Army. Kamisha Block was 20 years old when she was killed. She was from Vidor, Texas, and she was killed on August the 16th, 2007. Kamisha's best friend, Amanda Buck, they grew up together. And Amanda says, we rode the school bus together from kindergarten all the way through high school. Amanda said Kamisha knew where she was headed in life and had a big heart and wanted to help people. And that's why she joined the United States Army. Number 23 or 22, Specialist Donald Valentine III, United States Army. 21 years of age. He was killed September the 18th, 2007. He's from Houston, Texas. In the official statement on Donald's death, here's what the family said. Donald touched the lives of so many with his big heart. We will cherish those beautiful memories we shared with him. He made us very proud. Now heaven has another hero, and we continue to watch over, that continues to watch over us as an angel in heaven. A remarkable person, Specialist Donald Valentine III. Number 23 is Lance Corporal Jeremy Burris, United States Marine, age 22, killed in action on October the 8th, 2007. He's from Liberty, Texas. Liberty, Texas, according to the folks in Liberty, they claim that's the first settlement in Texas before Texas was even a part of the United States or even a republic. Liberty, Texas, an interesting town for a warrior to be from. He was an unapologetic person of religious faith, and he attended the non-denominational Cornerstone Church, where he led worship and praise services. He loved Texas, and his church pastor said at the funeral, no one had better say anything negative about his home state of Texas. Mr. Speaker, you got to love those Texas boys. They love our state. They love America. Number 24 is Staff Sergeant Eric Duckworth. He's the last photograph on this row, Mr. Speaker. He was a member of the United States Army. He was killed at the age of 26 on October the 10th, 2007. He was from Houston, Texas. His father, Michael, described him as an outgoing and good-humored son. He further said, Eric was full of love and laughter and a godly spirit, but above all, he was a true soldier and a proud warrior for the United States. Number 25, Corporal Scott McIntosh. He was a member of the United States Army. He was killed at the age of 26. On March the 10th, 2008, he was from Humble, Texas, my hometown. His mission in life was to meet and make friends with every person he came in contact with. He shared his hearty laugh and always had a smile to give to other people that he came across. Scott always had a positive outlook on life. He loved to hunt and fish, but most of all, he loved his family, the Army, and the country he lived in and his life. Staff Sergeant Sean Tusha, number 26 on this poster, Mr. Speaker. He was a member of the United States Army. He was killed at the age of 30 on April the 9th, 2008. He was from a little small town called Hull, Texas. That's H-U-L-L. As a teenager, Sean played football, and like most Texas rural boys, he loved it. He played at Old Seta High School, and he liked to ride horses. He considered himself a cowboy. He liked to bull ride. He was a man from small-town America, and he had a playful heart. He made a big impression on everybody that he knew growing up, and that was a positive impression. Number 27 on here, Lieutenant Colonel Mark Stratton II. Lieutenant Colonel Mark Stratton is the highest-ranking officer that was killed, that has been killed from our congressional district area. He was a member of the United States Air Force. At the age of 39, he was killed on May 26, 2009. He was from Houston, Texas. He was remembered by his friends as a man of unquestionable character and total loyalty to the people he loved. He was a patriotic American who exemplified the very best that American airmen have to offer. Number 28, this individual with a big grin on his face, Specialist Garrett Grimmel, United States Army. He was killed on June the 3rd, 2009 at the age of 20. He was also from a little small town, LaPorte, Texas. Jarrett was a member of the swim team and the surf club while he was in high school. He loved the outdoors, and he, of course, loved the beach and the surf, which were nearby in LaPorte. He spent his spare time parachuting and cliff diving. Jarrett lived his life to the fullest, but like the others I have mentioned, he loved America, and he loved to excel and do what he could do to be all he could be. He loved his family, and his family says that they will be forever cherishing the memories that he gave them because he touched every one of their lives. On the fifth row here, Jeffrey Johnson is still over here to the far left. He was a member of the United States Marine Corps, age 21 when he was killed on May 11, 2010, from Tomball, Texas. Corporal Jeffrey Johnson's funeral, at his funeral, his family remembered him as a son, a grandson, a brother, and a hero. His vehicle commander said Johnson was different from most of the fellow Marines because, as to sum up his commander, war is sheer misery, and the four of us in that truck, because of Jeff and his humor, were uplifted all the time. Corporal Johnson touched everybody and the lives that they lived with his life. The 30th individual is this sailor over here on the far portion of this poster. Petty Officer Zarin Wood. He went by Z, member of the United States Navy. He was from Houston. He was 29 years of age when he was killed in combat. And it was on his second tour of duty when he was killed. He graduated from South Houston High School in 1999, and after graduation he worked as a youth pastor and tutored children. He enlisted in the Navy in 2006, and on his second tour of duty he was killed in combat. The last group of individuals are the most recent individuals. All of these people, all of these individuals are put on this poster in the order of their death in Iraq or Afghanistan. In my office here in Washington, in my office in Humble and in Beaumont, Texas, we have larger photographs of all of these individuals. And you'll notice, Mr. Speaker, as you go through the halls of Congress and the offices of the House, you will see many such posters as this, listing those who have given their lives for America in the war in Iraq. But next on this list is Sergeant Brandon Burry. He was a member of the United States Marine Corps. He was killed at the age of 26 on June the 6th, 2010. June the 6th, D-Day. He was killed on the anniversary date of D-Day. He was from Kingwood, Texas. He was a big guy. He was 6'6", and he was all Marine. He was an impressive individual, and his friends say even back in middle school he knew what he wanted to do. He wanted to be a member of the United States Marine Corps. Next to him, number 32, Specialist Matthew Catlett, United States Army. At the age of 23 years, he was killed on June 7th, the very next day after Sergeant Brandon Burry was killed. He was from Houston, Texas, and he fought for liberty. He fought for a people he did not know in a land that he had never been. He was an American, that rare breed that gave his life for people far, far away and for Americans in this land. Staff Sergeant Eduardo Laredo, 34 years of age, a member of the United States Army. He was killed one day shy of his 35th birthday. He was from Houston, Texas, killed on June 24, 2010. His family says that Eduardo was an adventurer. He adored his wife and his family, and he loved to cook for his neighbors and his family. Mr. Speaker, we are blessed to have such rare breed of people as Staff Sergeant Eduardo Laredo and his fellow patriots and warriors. 34, Staff Sergeant Jesse Ainsworth, member of the United States Army, 24 years of age, killed on July the 10th, 2010 from Dayton, Texas, another small town in southeast Texas. Jesse's mother, Margaret Ainsworth, said Jesse was her hero, and he was her only son. And she said she used to pick him up when he was a little kid from kindergarten, and every Friday they'd go to Walmart and buy some toy. She said ever since Jesse was, and I quote, an itty-bitty fellow, he wanted to be a soldier in the United States Army. And he gave his life when he was 24 years of age for the rest of us. Number 35 on this poster of the Noble 36 is Staff Sergeant Leston Tony Winters, United States Army, 30 years of age when he was killed on July the 15th, 2010. He was from Sour Lake, Texas. Once again, small town, rural America. In 1998, he graduated from Hardin-Jefferson High School, and Winters had already completed 2 tours of duty in Iraq and decided on February of 2010 to leave his job and return to battle once more. He told his family that he felt compelled to be there with his buddies, even though he had a chance to stay home in Texas. He left behind, after his death, his wife Elizabeth and their 3 children, Jonathan, Remington, and Emma. Staff Sergeant First Class Calvin B. Harrison, this individual over here in the bottom right-hand corner, he was killed at the age of 31, and he, like several of the others I've mentioned, was from Cleveland, Texas. He was killed on September the 29th, 2010. After he graduated from high school in 1998, he enlisted in the Army following the path of his grandfather. His family said that he loved being a soldier and serving his country. He is survived by his 2 daughters, Azalea and Eliana. It's interesting about his funeral, Mr. Speaker, that I attended. The whole town of Cleveland, Texas, and nearby towns turned out for the funeral. Flags were strewn and hoisted all up and down Main Street in Cleveland, Texas. The businesses shut down. The school closed as the funeral procession came through Cleveland, Texas, honoring Sergeant First Class Calvin Harrison. And that funeral ceremony and processional with hundreds of people, young and old, showing praise and honor and respect to Calvin Harrison for his sacrifice for America. It was led by the Patriot Guard, those patriots that ride the Harley-Davidson motorcycles, most of them from the Vietnam era, who show their appreciation for the sacrifice by watching over the funeral procession and the funeral, by riding those motorcycles with an American flag on the back. These are the 36, the noble 36 from Southeast Texas, just a few of the people who have given their lives in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I mention these individuals because they, like all Americans that have been killed in Iraq and Afghanistan, are important to America. They are important to our history because freedom is not free. And that is not a trite expression. It's not free. It has always been expensive, going all the way back to the Revolutionary War. We're going to celebrate July 4th next week. And that war cost American lives, as has every war, because freedom is expensive. And it's our young people, men and women, who go and serve. And, Mr. Speaker, just like everybody serving today in Iraq and Afghanistan, every one of these people, every one volunteered. They raised their right hand and they stood forward and said, "I will serve. I will go. Call me." And they went. And we are to admire them for what they have done. They have gone down into the valley of the gun and the desert of the sun, and they have sacrificed their lives. Last week I happened to be in Iraq with other members of Congress. It's not even summer yet in Iraq. But we got off of that Black Hawk helicopter and it was 120 degrees in Iraq. And there they were, the American warriors, with their warrior uniforms on. And all that equipment they carry, how hot they were. 120 degrees. In Afghanistan and Iraq, it gets hot in the summer, and those days are coming. We should always appreciate them. We should also appreciate the ones that serve in other places in the world. On that same trip members of Congress had an opportunity to go to near the South China Sea and see some of our warriors on some island I'm not sure I could find on a map. But there on this remote island were our Navy SEALs, our Special Forces, our Marines, and our soldiers. They were doing an operation protecting the United States, representing the rest of us. So we should be proud of those that go and serve, those that volunteer, these, and those that are still there. We should appreciate the families that have stayed home while their loved ones go across the seas and represent this country. July the 4th is coming up. It's a great day in our history. I hope Americans fly the flag. I hope Americans tell their kids about our country and our history. That we should tell American children about these young people and others who every day raise their right hand and go off to war representing the rest of us. One of our former presidents once said, "I like to see a man proud of the place in which he lives, and I like to see a man live so that his place will be proud of him." All of these were proud of America, and America is proud of all of them and the rest that continue to serve. These noble 36, we are proud of them. Mr. Speaker, these are the few, the bold, the brave, the courageous. These are the Americans. These are the sons and daughters of Southeast Texas who have fallen in battle for their country. We are forever grateful for their sacrifice, and we are grateful for every man and woman in uniform today somewhere in the world representing the rest of us. And that's just the way it is. I yield back.